The day I became the most hated man in Lakeside Estates was the day I became its most powerful. My name is David Chen, and I'm a 52-year-old hydraulic engineer who spent 30 years building water management systems across 3 states. I thought I was buying my dream retirement home on 12 acres of pristine woodland. Instead, I bought myself a front row seat to watch an entire HOA community disappear underwater. And I was the one who opened the floodgates. It started with a certified letter demanding I pay $47,000 in emergency landscape compliance fees for land I'd owned for 8 years. Land that, according to Harold Pemberton and his HOA cronies, was suddenly community property needed for their luxury housing development. They gave me 30 days to pay or face foreclosure. What they didn't know was that my 12 acres sat on top of the only natural drainage system keeping their precious community from turning into a swamp. By the time I was done with Harold and his HOA board, 35 brand-new houses were sitting in 3 feet of standing water, and I was the proud owner of a lakefront property that quadrupled in value overnight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a quiet engineer became the nightmare that Harold Pemberton never saw coming. Before we dive into how I flooded an entire subdivision, I need to know, what's the worst thing an HOA has ever done to you? Drop your horror stories in the comments, because trust me, after hearing mine, you'll understand why some people deserve exactly what they get. And if you've ever dealt with power-hungry neighbors who think they own your property, hit that subscribe button, because I've got plenty more stories about putting bullies in their place. I moved to Lakeside Estates in 2016, 2 years after my wife Sarah passed from cancer. We planned to retire there together, build a workshop where I could tinker with old boat engines, maybe put in a small garden where she could grow her prize-winning tomatoes. Instead, I found myself alone on 12 acres of oak and maple trees, trying to figure out how to heal from losing the only woman I'd ever loved. The property was perfect, a 1960s ranch house sitting on a gentle slope that ran down to Miller Creek. The creek wasn't much to look at, maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but it had character. It meandered through my land like a lazy snake, disappearing into a culvert system that ran under the main road and connected to the county storm drainage. The whole setup was a textbook example of natural watershed management, something I'd studied for 3 decades as a hydraulic engineer. My neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. The HOA president, Harold Pemberton, even brought me a welcome basket with local honey and a bottle of wine. Harold was one of those men who wore polo shirts every day and talked about his golf handicap like it was a medical condition. He ran a successful insurance agency and lived in a 4,000-square-foot colonial that dominated the highest point in the development. During that first visit, he made a point of mentioning that my property wasn't technically part of the HOA since it predated the development by 40 years. "Lucky you," Harold said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No dues, no rules, no meetings. You get to live like a hermit while the rest of us maintain civilization." I should have paid more attention to that comment. Harold had the kind of smile that made you check your wallet afterward. The first few years were peaceful. I built my workshop, learned to cook for one, and slowly started to feel human again. My property became a refuge for local wildlife. Deer grazed in my meadow, blue herons fished in Miller Creek, and I even had a family of foxes that denayed under my tool shed. The creek ran clear and steady, fed by natural springs and the seasonal runoff from the surrounding hills. What I didn't realize was that Harold and his development company were watching every inch of my land with the hunger of a man who'd found oil in his backyard. The HOA had approved plans for a major expansion called Lakeside Estates Phase 2, 35 luxury homes on what was currently protected wetland. The only problem was that the wetland designation existed because Miller Creek provided the primary drainage for the entire area. Without my creek, the new development would need millions of dollars in artificial drainage systems. Unless, of course, they could somehow acquire my property. The harassment started small. Harold began showing up unannounced, always with some excuse about neighborly concern. He'd comment on my overgrown landscaping, suggest I might want to modernize my property to match the neighborhood aesthetic, and drop hints about how 12 acres was a lot of responsibility for one person. I politely explained that I liked my wild garden and had no interest in lawn services or landscape architects. Then came the letters. The first one arrived on a Monday morning in October 2019, typed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Harold as president. It informed me that several neighbors had complained about my unkempt appearance and potential fire hazards from fallen branches. The letter strongly suggested I hire a professional landscaping company to bring my property up to community standards. I threw the letter in the trash and went back to rebuilding a 1982 Johnson outboard motor. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, this time with more aggressive language about property values and community responsibility. Harold had apparently conducted a preliminary assessment and determined that my land posed significant environmental concerns due to unmanaged water flow and invasive vegetation. That's when I knew Harold was building a case. As a hydraulic engineer, I recognized the buzzwords. Someone had hired an environmental consultant to evaluate my property, and they were laying the groundwork for some kind of legal action. I decided it was time to do a little research of my own. I spent the next 3 weeks in the county planning office, pulling permits, environmental impact studies, and development proposals. What I found made my blood run cold. Lakeside Estates Phase 2 wasn't just a housing development. It was a massive land grab that would require rerouting Miller Creek, filling in protected wetlands, and installing a multi-million-dollar drainage system. The only way to make the project financially viable was to acquire my property and use the natural creek as their primary drainage. The development company had already received preliminary approval from the county, contingent on securing adequate water management resources. In plain English, they needed my creek or the project would die. Harold wasn't just being a bad neighbor. He was trying to steal my land. The third letter arrived in November, and this time Harold had backup. The envelope was thick with legal paperwork, including a formal notice of environmental violations and a demand that I appear before the HOA board to address serious concerns about water management and vegetation control. The letter mentioned that failure to comply could result in appropriate legal action to protect community interests. I showed up to that meeting with a briefcase full of my own research and 30 years of engineering experience. The HOA board consisted of Harold, his wife Margaret, a retired accountant named Bill Stevens, and 2 other homeowners who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They'd set up the meeting in Harold's living room, which immediately told me this wasn't about HOA business. It was about intimidation. Harold started with his concerned neighbor routine, explaining how my natural landscaping was creating drainage issues that could affect property values. Margaret chimed in with complaints about how my overgrown creek was attracting mosquitoes and undesirable wildlife. Bill Stevens had prepared a presentation about fire hazards and insurance liability that seemed designed to scare me into compliance. Then Harold dropped the hammer. He pulled out a thick folder of documents and explained that a recent survey had revealed significant boundary discrepancies between my property and the original HOA development. According to Harold's expert analysis, approximately 4 acres of my land, including the entire creek system, actually belonged to the community as shared natural resources. Now, David, Harold said with that insurance salesman smile, we're not looking to cause problems. We're prepared to offer you a fair price for the affected area. Say, $75,000 for the creek and the surrounding buffer zone. That's more than generous for what is essentially wetland. I looked at Harold's survey documents. They'd been prepared by Pemberton and Associates Land Development, Harold's own company. The boundary lines had been creatively redrawn to classify my creek as community drainage infrastructure that somehow belonged to the HOA. Harold, I said, keeping my voice level, this is my land. I have a clear title going back to 1976. Your development was built around my property, not the other way around. Harold's smile never wavered. I understand your confusion, David. Property law can be complicated, but we have a responsibility to protect the community's interests. If you're not willing to negotiate, we'll have to explore other options. What other options? Well, there's the matter of the environmental violations. The county has been very clear about enforcing wetland protection statutes. if we were to file a formal complaint about unauthorized modifications to a protected waterway. Harold shrugged. These things could get expensive very quickly. That's when I understood. Harold was threatening to frame me for environmental crimes on my own land. He'd use his connections with the county to create a legal nightmare that would cost me tens of thousands in legal fees and potentially result in criminal charges. The only way out would be to sell him my creek for a fraction of its value. I stood up and collected my papers. I'll need to think about this. Of course, Harold said, but don't think too long. The county environmental office is very responsive to community concerns. I walked out of that meeting knowing I was at war. The next 6 months were a masterclass in bureaucratic terrorism. Harold and his HOA board filed 17 separate complaints with various county departments. I was accused of illegal creek modification, unpermitted landscaping, fire code violations, septic system problems, and about 10 other infractions I'd never heard of. Each complaint triggered an inspection, and each inspection required me to take time off work, hire consultants, and prove my innocence. The septic system inspection alone cost me $2,400 and 3 days of having my yard torn up by excavators. The fire safety inspection required me to hire a forestry consultant to assess every dead branch on my property. The creek modification investigation took 2 months and required me to provide 40 years of geological surveys to prove I hadn't altered the waterway. Every single complaint was dismissed, but Harold didn't care about winning. He cared about bleeding me dry and making my life miserable until I agreed to sell. The breaking point came in March 2020, right as the world was shutting down for COVID. I was dealing with my own health scare, suspicious growth on my kidney that turned out to be benign, but required surgery and months of recovery. I was weak, stressed, and emotionally drained from fighting Harold's legal war. That's when a certified letter arrived demanding $47,000 in emergency landscape compliance fees. According to Harold's latest legal theory, my property had been grandfathered into the HOA through something called community integration statutes. The letter cited a dozen legal precedents I'd never heard of and claimed that my years of failing to maintain community standards had resulted in significant remediation costs that I was now responsible for paying. The letter gave me 30 days to pay the full amount or face foreclosure proceedings. I sat in my kitchen, staring at that letter, and felt something break inside me. Sarah had always been the fighter in our relationship. She'd been the one who stood up to bullies, who never backed down from a challenge, who taught me that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to hit back harder than they hit you. I could almost hear her voice. David, you're an engineer. You solve problems. So solve this one. That night, I opened my laptop and started researching Harold Pemberton and his development company. If he wanted to play dirty, I was going to show him what dirty really looked like. The first thing I discovered was that Harold Insurance Agency was built on a foundation of creative billing practices. A quick search of state insurance commission records showed that Pemberton Insurance had been fined 6 times in the past 5 years for billing irregularities and client service failures. Harold was the kind of businessman who survived by finding the gray areas and regulations and living there. The second thing I found was that Lakeside Estates Phase 2 was in serious financial trouble. The environmental impact studies had revealed that the proposed development would require a $4.2 million drainage system to prevent flooding. The only way to make the project viable was to acquire my property and use Miller Creek as natural drainage. But here's what Harold didn't know. I had spent 30 years designing drainage systems for developments exactly like his. I knew every trick, every shortcut, and every way that developers tried to cut corners on water management. And I knew that Harold's project was built on a lie. The third thing I discovered was the most important. Harold had never actually filed the proper paperwork to claim my land belonged to the HOA. All of his legal threats were bluffs based on fabricated surveys and made-up statutes. He was counting on me being too intimidated or too broke to fight back. Harold had made one crucial mistake. He'd pick a fight with someone who understood water better than he did. I spent the next month conducting my own survey of the area, using equipment I'd borrowed from my former employer. What I found was fascinating. Miller Creek wasn't just a small waterway running through my property. It was the primary drainage for the entire Lakeside Estates development. The original builders had designed the community around my creek, using it to handle all the stormwater runoff from 127 homes. The system worked perfectly as long as Miller Creek continued to flow freely through my land and into the county storm drainage system. But it was also incredibly fragile. The creek had been channeled, diverted, and modified so many times that it was completely dependent on the natural flow patterns through my property. If something were to happen to disrupt that flow, say if someone were to redirect the creek or block its natural path, the entire subdivision would flood during the next heavy rain. I also discovered that Harold's development company had taken some interesting shortcuts during the original construction. Instead of installing proper drainage systems for each house, they'd simply directed all the runoff into Miller Creek. It was cheaper and easier than building a real drainage infrastructure, but it was also completely illegal. The county's stormwater management regulations required developments to handle their own drainage without impacting natural waterways. Harold's company had violated about 15 different environmental statutes, and they'd been getting away with it for 8 years because no one had bothered to check. Now I had a choice. I could fight Harold's foreclosure threat in court, which would cost me thousands and take years to resolve, or I could use his own illegal drainage system against him. I chose option 2. The beauty of being a hydraulic engineer is that you understand how water wants to move. Water doesn't care about property lines or HOA bylaws or Harold Pemberton's development plans. Water follows the path of least resistance, and it always finds a way. Harold's entire community was built in a natural floodplain that had been artificially drained using Miller Creek. The developers had essentially created a bowl and then punched a hole in the bottom to let the water out. As long as that hole stayed open, everything was fine. But if someone were to close that hole, I started with the county environmental office. I filed a formal complaint about illegal stormwater management practices at Lakeside Estates, complete with photographs, survey data, and detailed engineering analysis. I documented how the development had violated wetland protection statutes by diverting natural drainage without permits. The complaint triggered an immediate investigation. County inspectors descended on Lakeside Estates like locusts, measuring drainage systems, testing water flow, and documenting every violation they could find. Within 2 weeks, the county had issued a cease and desist order that prohibited any further development in the area until the drainage issues were resolved. Harold's Phase 2 project was officially dead, but that was just the beginning. While the county was investigating the HOA's violations, I was implementing my own solution to the drainage problem. As the legal owner of the land where Miller Creek originated, I had every right to modify the waterway on my own property. And as a licensed hydraulic engineer, I was fully qualified to make those modifications. I hired a small excavation company to help me with what I called creek restoration. We were going to return Miller Creek to its natural pre-development flow pattern. This would involve redirecting the creek away from the artificial channels that Harold's company had created and letting it follow its original path through my property. The work took 3 weeks and cost me $18,000. We carefully excavated the old creek bed, installed proper erosion controls, and created a series of natural retention ponds that would help manage seasonal flooding. From an environmental perspective, it was a vast improvement over the artificial drainage system. From Harold's perspective, it was a declaration of war. The natural path of Miller Creek didn't flow onto the main road and into the county storm system. Instead, it meandered through my property, collected in a series of natural wetlands, and eventually percolated into the groundwater. It was a beautiful, environmentally sound system that had worked perfectly for thousands of years. It also meant that all the stormwater runoff from 127 homes in Lakeside Estates no longer had anywhere to go. I finished the creek restoration on a Tuesday in late April. Wednesday was sunny and clear. Thursday brought the first spring thunderstorm of the season. I watched from my kitchen window as Miller Creek performed exactly as I designed it to. The water level rose during the storm, filled my retention ponds, and then slowly soaked into the ground. My property handled the runoff beautifully, creating a series of temporary wetlands that would provide habitat for wildlife and help recharge the local aquifer. Down in Lakeside Estates, the scene was quite different. Without Miller Creek to carry away the stormwater, the entire development began a flood. Water collected in the streets, backed up into storm drains, and started seeping into basements. By Thursday evening, the lower section of the development was sitting in 6 inches of standing water. Harold called me at 9 p.m., screaming about sabotage and property damage and legal action. I listened to his rant for about 30 seconds before cutting him off. Harold, I restored Miller Creek to its natural flow pattern. This is how the watershed is supposed to work. If your development is flooding, that's because it was built in a floodplain without proper drainage. You can't just redirect a creek. Harold shouted, "That's our drainage system. Harold, it's my creek on my land. I could do whatever I want with it." And according to the county environmental office, your development never had permission to use Miller Creek for drainage in the first place. The silence on the other end of the phone was beautiful. "This isn't over," Harold finally said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Harold tried everything he could think of. He filed emergency injunctions to force me to restore his illegal drainage system. He complained to the county about my unauthorized creek modification. He even tried to get the state environmental agency to classify my restoration as illegal wetland destruction. Every single complaint was dismissed. I had followed every regulation, obtained every permit, and documented every step of the process. My creek restoration was not only legal, it was environmentally beneficial. Meanwhile, Harold's development was slowly sinking. The spring rains continued through May, and each storm brought more flooding to Lakeside Estates. What started as puddles in the street became permanent standing water. Basements flooded. Septic systems failed. The HOA had to hire industrial pumps to try to remove the water, but just kept coming back. Property values collapsed overnight. Houses that had been worth $400,000 were suddenly unsellable. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover flood damage because the development had been built in a floodplain. Homeowners started filing lawsuits against Harold's development company for fraud and misrepresentation. The beautiful part was that Harold couldn't fix the problem without admitting he'd created it. To restore drainage to the development, he would have to confess that his company had illegally used Miller Creek for 8 years. That confession would open him up to massive environmental fines and criminal charges. Harold was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. But I wasn't done yet. While Harold was dealing with his flooding problem, I was working on phase 2 of my revenge. Remember, Harold had tried to steal my land by claiming it belonged to the HOA. I decided to return the favor by claiming something that actually did belong to me. I hired a property law attorney to research the original development agreements for Lakeside Estates. What we found was fascinating. Harold's company had been granted easements to use Miller Creek for drainage, but those easements were contingent on maintaining the creek in its natural state and without impact to upstream or downstream property owners. By modifying the creek to handle development runoff, Harold had violated the terms of his easement. That violation voided the easement and gave me the right to demand compensation for 8 years of unauthorized use of my property. My attorney calculated that Harold's company owed me $340,000 in back rent for using my creek as their drainage system. But that wasn't the best part. The original development agreement also included a clause that required Harold's company to provide adequate drainage infrastructure for the community. Since Harold had used my creek instead of building proper drainage, he'd failed to fulfill his contractual obligations to the homeowners. That failure gave me the right to demand that Harold either build the proper drainage system he'd promised or sell the affected properties to me at current market value. Given that the affected properties were now sitting in 3 feet of standing water, current market value was essentially zero. While my attorney was building our legal case, I was documenting every day of Harold's suffering. I started taking daily photographs of the flooded development, creating a detailed record of the water levels, the failed septic systems, and the growing mold problems. I wanted to capture every moment of Harold's empire crumbling. The homeowners were in full panic mode. Margaret Pemberton was fielding dozens of angry phone calls every day from residents demanding answers about the flooding. The HOA board had emergency meetings every week, but there was nothing they could do. They couldn't force me to restore their illegal drainage system, and they couldn't afford to build a proper replacement. Some residents tried to take matters into their own hands. I caught 3 different homeowners sneaking onto my property at night, apparently trying to dig channels to redirect water back into Miller Creek. I installed motion sensor cameras and floodlights, then sent the footage to my attorney as evidence of trespassing. The psychological warfare was beautiful. Every morning, Harold would drive past my house on his way to work, and he'd see me sitting on my porch, drinking coffee and watching the water level in his development. I'd wave at him with a friendly smile, the same smile he'd used when he first tried to intimidate me. The look on his face was priceless. By this point, the local news had picked up the story. A reporter from Channel 7 interviewed me about natural flood mitigation and sustainable water management. I played the part of the concerned environmentalist, explaining how my creek restoration was helping to protect the local ecosystem. I never mentioned Harold by name, but everyone in town knew exactly what was happening. The reporter also interviewed Harold, who looked like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He kept insisting that the flooding was caused by illegal tampering with community infrastructure and that I was destroying property values for personal gain. The more he talked, the more desperate he sounded. That news story was the final nail in Harold's coffin. Once the flooding was public knowledge, property values in Lakeside estates completely collapsed. Real estate agents stopped showing houses in the development. The few potential buyers who did show up took one look at the standing water and drove away immediately. Harold received my legal demand on a Monday morning in June. By that afternoon, he was at my door with a settlement offer. "David, we can work this out," Harold said. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 2 months. His polo shirt was wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and his famous smile had been replaced by the desperate expression of a man watching his empire crumble. "We can absolutely work this out," I agreed. "You can pay me the $340,000 you owe me for using my creek, plus the $47,000 in fraudulent fees you try to charge me, plus damages for the stress and legal costs you've caused me over the past year." Harold's face went pale. "That's over $400,000. I don't have that kind of money." "Then you can sell me the 35 houses in Phase 2 at current market value," I said. "I'll give you $50,000 for all of them. They're worth 10 times that much." "Not anymore. Not sitting in 3 feet of water." Harold tried to negotiate, but we both knew he was finished. His development company was facing millions in lawsuits from homeowners. His insurance agency was under investigation for fraud, and his reputation in the community was destroyed. 3 weeks later, Harold agreed to sell me the 35 flooded houses for $75,000. I also received a formal apology from the HOA board and a promise that they would never again interfere with my property. But the story gets better. Once I owned the flooded houses, I had the legal right to fix the drainage problem I'd created. I hired the same excavation company to restore the artificial channels that connected my creek to the county storm system. Within 2 weeks, the floodwater was gone and the houses were habitable again. I took my time with the restoration, though. I wanted Harold to sweat a little longer. For 3 weeks, I let those 35 houses sit in standing water while I evaluated the best approach to drainage restoration. Every day, Harold would drive past the development and see his former empire rotting in the flood. When I finally did restore the drainage, it was a masterpiece of engineering. I created a hybrid system that combined the natural flow of Miller Creek with modern stormwater management technology. The result was a drainage system that could handle a 100-year flood without breaking a sweat. The houses weren't just habitable, they were better than before. The flooding had forced me to replace all the flooring, update the electrical systems, and install modern sump pumps in every basement. By the time I was done, those 35 houses were the most flood-resistant properties in the county. I sold 34 of the houses over the next 6 months for an average of $350,000 each. Every single buyer got a detailed report about the new drainage system and a personal guarantee from me that their property would never flood again. Word spread quickly that the Miller Creek houses were the safest investment in the area. I made sure to invite Harold to the open house for the first property I sold. He stood in the living room of a house that had been sitting in 3 feet of water just months earlier, watching me shake hands with the new owners and deposit a $350,000 check. The look on his face was worth more than the money. The 35th house, the one with the best view of Miller Creek, became my new home. I donated my original 12 acres to the county as a nature preserve, complete with hiking trails and educational signage about wetland conservation. The park was officially named the Sarah Chun Memorial Wetland in honor of my late wife. Harold and Margaret moved to Florida about 6 months later. I heard through the grapevine that Harold had to declare bankruptcy after the lawsuits from the flooded homeowners were settled. His insurance agency was investigated by the state and eventually shut down for fraudulent practices. Margaret filed for divorce about a year later, citing irreconcilable differences and financial irresponsibility. The HOA dissolved due to legal costs and lack of leadership. The remaining homeowners formed a loose neighborhood association that focused on community events rather than property regulations. It was amazing how friendly everyone became once Harold was gone. The final twist came 6 months later when I received a letter from the state environmental agency. They were giving me an award for outstanding achievement in wetland restoration and community environmental stewardship. The award came with a $10,000 grant to fund additional conservation work. I used the money to build a small dock on Miller Creek, where I keep the 1982 Johnson outboard motor I'd been restoring when this whole mess started. Sometimes I sit there in the evening, watching the herons fish and the foxes drink from a creek, and I think about Sarah. I think she would have been proud of the way I finally learned to fight back. Harold taught me an important lesson about bullies. They're only powerful when you let them be. The moment you stop being afraid and start using your own strengths against them, they crumble faster than a house built on a floodplain. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had a neighbor or HOA president who thought they could push you around? What did you do about it? Did you fight back? Or did you let them win? Drop your stories in the comments because I love hearing about people who refuse to be victims. And if you enjoyed watching Harold get exactly what he deserved, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've got plenty more stories about bullies who bit off more than they could chew. And trust me, they all get their comeuppance in the end. The truth is, most bullies are cowards at heart. They pick on people they think won't fight back. But sometimes, just sometimes, they pick the wrong person. Harold Pemberton thought he was stealing land from a grieving widower who wouldn't know how to defend himself. Instead, he picked a fight with a hydraulic engineer who understood that water always wins. And in the end, I let the water do all the talking.